Hello and welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, a podcast for people who care about environmental sustainability and climate action. I'm your host, Derval Barzey, and joining me today is a senior lecturer of soil science at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine. He is the Deputy Dean, Outreach and Internationalization, Faculty of Food and Agriculture, and serves in many other capacities, including as a Vice President of the Latin America and the Caribbean Soil Partnership, Vice Chair to the Intergovernmental Working Group on Drought of the UNCCD, and as Science Advisor to the Partnership Initiative for Sustainable Soil Management. He is an advocate for soil and has a keen interest in organic waste management, specifically composting and its use as a soil quality enhancer. He has consulted in several Caribbean countries on sustainable soil and land management, composting, crop nutrition, and more, and is dedicated towards Caribbean development. I'm incredibly excited to welcome Dr. Gaius Eudoxie to the Climate Conscious Podcast. Hi, Dr. Eudoxie.
Hi, good day, Derval, and good day to all your listeners. And it's a pleasure being on the Climate Conscious podcast. And I'm happy to speak today with you all on issues pertaining to soil. As I mentioned, I am a true advocate for soil, and it's one of those resources that I do believe that our general population has to have a greater appreciation for in that regard. So it's a pleasure being here, and I'm hoping to share with the audience as much information on soils as possible. Thank you again for having me.
So, Dr. Eudoxie, both your work and leisure activities, they seem to revolve around this valuable but often underrated resource. It's been described as the Earth's greatest and oldest resource. But when we think of food and food production, we often think more of, crop varieties, genetic modification, equipment, technology. But what will we be or what will we do without soil? First of all, do you agree that soils are underrated?
Thanks so much for that particular question, and just probably highlighting the role of soils and probably as well why soils do not fall within the sphere of resources as like other resources such as water, air, biodiversity, etc. I think one of the things is that although it's kind of ubiquitous, it's not necessarily very visible to us. And that's one of the reasons why it's not necessarily, or attention is not necessarily paid to soil as much as the other resources. So it is one of those resources that requires a more microscopic inspection for us to get a better understanding of the role that it plays in our society. So I'll give you, for instance, an example of where or why persons could find information pertaining to, just to understand how your soils work. The GSP, which is the Global Soil Partnership, was started for that very reason. It falls under the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. And one of the things that came out at the high-level meetings was that the fact that we recognize that although we use it for multiple purposes, persons do not pay attention to it. And what we were finding is a trend of degradation of our soils. And in that degradation eventually will lead to a situation of food insecurity and among many other negative impacts on our overall livelihood. So that they developed this Global Soil Partnership as a kind of voluntary organization with one of the key pillars of focuses was to essentially ensure that persons are aware of the role of soils and its importance, such that when you become aware and more knowledgeable, your actions and changes in your behavior and attitudes occur. So they developed this very interesting video that I want to put your listeners on to called Do You Know Soils? And it's a very short, probably like 6-7 minute video you can find on YouTube. And what it does is that it tries to show us the importance of soils in our economy. And not just only for food production, but it shows us the roles that soils play in our everyday lives, roles that many of our general public are not aware of. And because you are not aware, your actions generally are sort of unconscious towards more degradation that is leading to this finite resource essentially becoming more and more limited and more reduced in its ability to continue to provide the services that it does for us. So yes, there is a key role for soils to play, and certainly persons have to be more aware of that role and its importance.
As one of your former students, in your lectures on soils, your passion was very evident. So tell us, where did your enthusiasm for soils originate?
That's a really nice question. And, I always tell persons that is what, makes the difference between getting a job and getting a career. A career is something that you are passionate about and something that you see meaning in doing. And you certainly get rewards out of doing it. And that is what drove me. I remember when I was in secondary school, I'm St. Lucian by nationality. And in secondary school, when I was in Form 5, the normal things we do that I currently do as a deputy dean as well, go out to these schools and have career fairs. So they had a career fair in our school, and one of the persons who came to speak on careers in agriculture was a soil scientist, and he had only recently finished his BSc degree right here at the very same University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. And he mentioned this thing about soil. Now, I grew up in a farming family, so I'm accustomed of dealing with soil, but I never perceived that you could have actually studied soil as a discipline, even going through secondary school. Then he explained afterwards, the nature of soil and, how old the science of soil was. So it was very intriguing to me. And I said, but I couldn't believe that persons actually spend their entire career, dealing with dirt. Something that we typically walk over and pay absolutely no attention to. But then it hit me that this thing has some significance and some importance. So it was from that time that I had a desire for me to understand a little more about this resource, that other persons seem not to be, or not to show that amount of care for. So my progression throughout has been always through the sciences. It so happened that I was able to continue to do A-levels. I did sciences and I came back into the university. Even during that time, I had opportunity to go on to do other disciplines. But the drive had always been there to get a better understanding of soil science. I spent a year as well working in a soil science laboratory under that very same person before I came to UE, who came to speak to the students. So I got a kind of resolve around understanding this resource and getting a deeper understanding of how we mismanage it. And through our mismanagement leads to its deterioration, degradation, and then our inability to be able to utilize it in the future. So going through UE, again, I was attracted to the understanding, getting some more details and in-depth. And then I said, okay, after I did my undergrad, I said, all right, I think I've made up my mind that this is the career that I would wish for. And the career wasn't to be a lecturer. The career was to be a soil scientist. Wherever that placed me, whether it be in research, in development, in policy, in academia and education, that was more or less not any of my choosing. But what I knew I wanted to do was to be someone who studied our soils, understood particularly for small islands where our land size is limited, the need for appropriate sustainable management of those soils, particularly under conditions that we're facing now as the climate is changing on us. How are we able to manage those soils? And I thought that is an area when we looked at the overall scope that had not gotten the kind of attention that it deserved. And I think that was my motivation heading into that particular discipline. And I have to admit, having been in that discipline now as a professional for over 20 years, I have not been disappointed, not even in a small amount with regards to that decision.
So 20 years dealing with the tribe, and that has allowed you to have a very fulfilling
Wonderful. Yeah.
Goal 2 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is zero hunger by 2030. One of its targets is to ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices that increase productivity and production, and also helps maintain ecosystems and strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change, which is one of the biggest crises we are facing now. Extreme weather, drought, flooding, and these other disasters, and to also progressively improve land and soil quality. So as someone who serves on many regional bodies, I think you are well positioned to give us some insights on the situation with food security in the region. So where are we as a region?
As a region, I think we have been making strides, and we have been putting plans in place and policies in place to guarantee that we can minimize any impacts of a failing global food security. So I think regionally we have stepped up. We have, I think, coordinated efficiently our efforts towards security. So at the regional level, right after, for instance, the COVID pandemic became a reality for us, there were a number of regional initiatives at CARICOM level that led to the development of a regional food security plan amidst COVID. Now, bearing in mind that even prior to that, there were a number of initiatives and as well agreements, for instance, the JACDEO initiative pertaining to regional food security. So that discussion has been on the cards for a very long time. Similarly, within at the regional level, we also have policies and plans pertaining to how we manage our natural resources being a very key input into our ability to be food and nutrition secure. So at the regional level, we have had, in my mind, adequate amounts of coordination, which is what our regional bodies try to do. And I think we have addressed that effectively. Yeah? So regionally, I think there is a plan. And at the regional level, the essence is as well to support national implementation of those particular types of actions. So I think we have done a very good job. Our response has been timely. It has been efficient, and it matches the magnitude of the impacts and issues that we face at this point in time or have faced in previous times. So regionally, I think we're okay. However, implementation at national level sometimes a bit laggard because the national level versus the regional level have obviously different structures and different frameworks and different hierarchies upon which it could work. So for instance, where we speak about food production and talk about food security and for instance, the elements of food security, one of them being food availability, and that speaks to our ability to produce foods. I think at national level, when you look across the Caribbean countries, I don't think that we have approached that in a manner that is as strategic as we can. Yeah, I do not think that we have well thought out or laid a path in terms of a policy for us to follow in terms of what will guide our strategic interventions with regards to dealing with that. However, COVID has, amplified and essentially allowed for us to act with a little more exuberance pertaining to these types of activities, and we see a little more effort on the ground with it. But nonetheless, I do not think that we are in a position to guarantee our own food security. Now, I'm bringing it down a little further to the point where we have not necessarily as well addressed our issue of utilizing our resources to the point where it could facilitate, in my mind, attaining sustainable goal number 2. And if you think about goal number 2, where we talk about these types of resources like land and soil, we also have to talk about goal number 15, life on land. One of the things we have not necessarily addressed is the importance of these finite resources that we have within our member states. And as small island developing states, our finite resources puts us at a disadvantage relative to our continental countries. So while you will see these continental countries moving towards policies that guarantees wise use of those finite resources, as small islands where it is more prudent for us to do so, we have not done so. And what we see manifesting is a lot of mismanagement of those resources that is putting us in further jeopardy. Now, COVID-19, we know, has created a situation that could create supply chain disruptions. And that is what created all of the essence of the business of trying to deal with food security regionally and as well nationally. But irrespective of that, the fact remains that we still have to mind our business with our resources here, because it's these resources that are going to be able to essentially buffer any kinds of changes in these international systems for us. And if we do not have policies, if we do not have management plans, if we do not have guidelines as to how to go about dealing with those resources, soils, in my mind, being one of the key ones, we will find ourselves in a very unsustainable future. And I say so on the backdrop that when you think about how we react to soils, soils are the center of our ecosystem. There's nothing that soils doesn't relate. For instance, if you go and look at a conceptual framework of natural resources, let's say we have the biosphere, which you know deals with our plants and our animals. We have the hydrosphere, which deals with our water. We have the atmosphere, which deals with our air. We have the lithosphere, which deals with our minerals and rocks. The one thing that links all of those resources is what we call the pedosphere, which is the soil. And that at the center of all of them means that it has a critical functional relationship in terms of modifying all of that. And being a climate scientist and somewhat interested in that, you would appreciate the modifying role that our soils play on climate. I mean, even now it's coming out from the IPCC and the UNFCCC that soils by far, and how we use soils, particularly for agriculture, is the number one adaptation mechanism for mitigating climate change. So that has some role to play in how we manifest our land use policies and how we manifest how we will treat and manage those lands. And in my mind, that is one of the things that we need at national levels, such that, you know, whatever plans we may put forward for food and nutrition security, it will be something sustainable.
But you made an interesting statement that soils are the center of our ecosystem. But I think as humans, we tend to think that we are the center of the ecosystem, just dominate everything and use resources to their end. You also highlighted some of the key issues in terms of mismanagement of this finite resource. I mean, here in Trinidad and Tobago, we tend to focus on the finite resource mainly as our oil and gas. And we worry about reserves, how many years again we have for oil and gas, but maybe we should be looking at how many years we have again for soils. The new president of Guyana, he spoke about, although they are pursuing their development of their hydrocarbon resources, he committed that they are not going to neglect the agricultural sector. And I think that is critical, not only for their national sustainable development, but also the regions. So, Dr. Eudoxie, how would you define sustainable and resilient agriculture?
I also, just before I answer that question, Derval, I want to certainly as well compliment the Republic of Guyana pertaining to that particular decision. And Guyana has always been very much like probably Jamaica and Belize within our regional bloc, advocates for agriculture. And noting that with regards to ensuring that the agricultural sector also probably complementary and simultaneously develops with their energy sector. And I think that is one lesson they probably would learn from other countries in the region who may have had hydrocarbon resources as well. But nonetheless, we also have to appreciate that their physical dimensions and their physical resources are very different from some of the smaller islands. So I guess we have to just bear that in mind. But getting back to the question pertaining to what is sustainable agriculture, or what does that mean? It means different things to different people, and there are several perspectives on that. And what I was alluding to was the fact that although they have different perspectives of sustainable agriculture and sustainable agricultural practices, the essence of sustainability doesn't change. Now, for us, if you think about it, even in Trinidad, we have a strategic plan that links to the SDGs, with our own national development goals as well. And in that regard, they link to all of those same key elements, talking about sustainability in the three dimensions, being social, economic, and environmental. So the essence is that sustainable practices must ensure those three things, or three criteria, are met. Now, once you have a practice that meets that practice is a sustainable practice. And that practice is a practice that also builds resilience. So that means if you utilize it and you implement that practice, not only are you going to guarantee that you're going to be able to continue what you're doing, what you're actually doing is improving your resilience to shocks in the system. And whether that shock be an anthropogenic shock or a natural shock, that is the benefit of having sustainable systems. So I will speak to one particular example of a sustainable practice that, for instance, in the region has absolute benefit in the region, but we have not necessarily adapted our systems to that. For instance, the incorporation of stable organic material is a practice that can be deemed as sustainable. And the reason why it is that the incorporation of that into our soils, and baseline, our soils have very low organic matter content just because of the fact that we're in the humid tropics. Our contents generally tend to be less than 3%, which is very low. Incorporation of organic matter does a number of things to the soil. Now, if you think about agriculture, especially extensive agriculture, the basis of extensive agriculture is the soil. So if you improve the quality of the soil, you improve the quality of your crop and your production overall. So that means your efficiency is going to increase. But not only that, we also appreciate the fact that if you add stable organic matter to our soils, it is, in essence, sequestering carbon. So that means we are also contributing to a reduction as a mitigation action. Further to that, the addition of organic matter stabilizes our soils, means that our soils are more protected from natural hazards such as intense rainfalls, and as well degradation. So that means now the resilience is increased physically or naturally within that soil. That practice as well brings into place another key element there of a loop cycle, or what we call circular models. So because the organic matter comes from waste that would have otherwise gone to a landfill. So that one process of applying stabilized organic material is so important that it brings in several different key sustainability elements into it and allows for our production to increase whilst we are minimizing waste and increasing our resilience against climate change. So in my mind, that is by far one of the more prominent sustainable practices that we could use in our agricultural setting. And to me, it is one of those things that has the most values. And as I'm speaking to you about it, I can tell you outright, and the listeners, that we are about to have a model project on that same concept as a proof of concept to show our primary producers the importance of that and the fact that it can work to the point where it's economical. It will increase your livelihood because of the earnings that you will gain, and obviously the reduction in losses that you will face. And as well, it brings benefits from the environmental perspective. So this is but just one example of many.
So we're getting into an area that I'm quite interested in terms of composting and also the circular economy. So tutored by my colleague Shan Young, I started composting back in May. And I often share about it on social media to encourage others to consider it, because it's one step towards reducing our negative impact on the environment by diverting organic waste away from the landfills. I'm also looking forward to using it as organic fertilizer in my kitchen garden. Well, I know this is on a small scale. As you mentioned, there's great potential for it in terms of larger scale production. What else would you tell persons about composting?
Certainly, there's absolutely great value. We have not seen it again as a process that has value. But I have to admit, slowly but surely, there are interests from both public and private sectors pertaining to moving it forward. I think that the essence would be that at the farm level, if farmers are not necessarily aware of the benefits that they generate or can generate from that process, it becomes something more of a task than something that will improve on their own productivity. Because one of the things that we do know is that farmers already apply copious amounts of what we call unstabilized organic matter, which is manure. But because it is unstabilized, means that it still has a very quick rate of decomposition and degradation. And that may cause more problems than benefits. For instance, these same manures, they break down quickly and hence release a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Secondly, because they are high in nutrients and farmers don't necessarily incorporate them, they rest them on the surface, they also lead to tremendous amounts of nutrient leaching, which we know could lead to environmental problems. So the essence in there is that we have to see how we could kind of ensure that the organic amendments that farmers already know has a direct impact on their overall productivity. We could do it in a sustainable way. And the way in which we could do that is through the process of composting. And I would just mention that, Cyan is a mutual friend. Cyan just recently delivered a course on waste management for us in our series of short courses at our business development office. And very soon, actually, probably within the next 2 weeks, I'll be delivering a short course on composting as well. So the essence is there is that we have been doing it, and a lot of persons do it at the level of the backyard. But there is a need for us to recognize that where we speak about sustainable agriculture, particularly in extensive agriculture, where if you watch how we prepare our lands in a very conventional manner, where when we finish doing our tillage, the land is left bare. And because it is left bare, any heavy rainfall degrades that land and creates tremendous amounts of erosion. And I just want to put a perspective on the issue of erosion. Sometimes I remember one time dealing with a high-level delegation, and I was, pertaining to getting them to act on soil management. And what I told them was that, when we do not act on the actual cause or on the source of the pollution, it creates more problems and it is more costly for us down the line. So, think about it. When we treat water, even Wassa right here in Trinidad, when we treat water, the only thing we treat water for is for sediments. That is what we treat our water for. It's for sediments. And if you can remember our soil science, it has all to do with Stokes' law. Heavier particles settle faster. So that is what we treat for in our water. But where are the sediments coming from? The sediments are coming from our soils because we do not use appropriate, sustainable soil management practices to minimize soil erosion. And that is where that business of ensuring activities like compost incorporation is such an important concept for long-term use of those soils. Because, one of the things when I do workshops for farmers say, 20 years ago, that soil used to produce so much. Now, the more I have to add to it, the less I'm getting. And I tell them that is quite correct, because 20 years ago, your soil probably was a very different soil than it is now. And because we do not treat the soil as we would treat our own bodies, you wouldn't pass 20 years without going and do a checkup. You would want to find out what is happening with your body. But we don't treat our soils like that. We don't treat it as a living element. And because of that, we expect that it will behave in the same manner, irrespective of the fact that it is exposed to hazards and elements of degradation. So that is one of the things that we have to pay attention to.
Well, you have outlined the downward spiral in terms of utilizing unsustainable agricultural practices that lead to land degradation. And then our farmers are forced, or they feel that they have to use even more probably fertilizers and chemicals to achieve a certain yield or production. And so it continues. But I would like you to just clarify for us, or shed some light on the issue of stable versus unstable organic material in soils.
So when I say stable, I simply mean that the carbon now is less exposed or less susceptible to degradation. So for instance, let's think about charcoal. A lot of us like barbecue, yeah? And I'm sure most persons understand probably how we generate charcoal through a process of pyrolysis. Yeah. So the essence is that what we're doing is that we're burning our carbon in a low oxygen environment. So what happens is that you only have partial release of carbon dioxide if you appreciate the degradative process, but some of the carbon remains locked up in its complex form, right? So for us, that means that under the process of formation of charcoal, that is called thermal stabilization, because it's heat we're using to stabilize it. However, through the process of composting, what we're doing is a biochemical stabilization, because we're actually using the ability of our microbes that are, again, part of our living soil to stabilize a portion, generally 2/3 of the carbon, to stabilize that carbon within the materials such that it becomes more challenging for it to continue to degrade. So what you would find is that that material would last a lot longer in the soil environment than, for instance, an unstabilized form such as our manures. So for instance, manure would probably degrade within probably a growing season. That is probably between 6 months to 1 year. After application, it would completely degrade with very small amounts turning into stabilized forms, what we call humus in our soils. However, the composting process accelerates that humification or stabilization of our carbon, such that when we add the compost, we're adding a significant amount of already stabilized material to our soils. So that means it lasts a way longer period than our non-stabilized versions. So it brings benefits over longer periods of time to our soils than our unstabilized forms. And the fact is, because it has a greater amount of stabilized material, that stabilized material has a stronger influence on essentially the quality of the soil, because that humus material sort of meshes over our particles in the soil and coats them and protects them from degradative elements such as high intense rainfalls. So that is why it is such an important amendment to our soils. It makes or improves on the quality of that soil to the point where, not only productivity increases, as I said before, but you also have improvement in environmental and ecosystem services. You get better water infiltration, you get better purification, you get better gaseous exchange within the soil system, you get abundance of soil microorganisms, so your biodiversity is more improved within the soil. So a lot of those services are improved within the soil, which then leads to increased resilience, as I said, from various stressors. So it is important, and we want to make that distinction, that stabilized forms of organic matter are a better amendment to our soils than non-stabilized forms.
I do my little backyard farming, and in the past I would use cow manure and maybe some rotten wood. But I'm really proud of my little compost heap. it's coming along nicely. It has heat as
No.
as
But
Shannon.
nothing is wrong in the composter. That's it. I just want to say, put the manure in the compost heap and let it compost. Nothing is wrong with that.
So you're saying add the cow manure in the compost heap, because I only put plant matter in my compost.
No. You probably don't want to put your household pet. Yeah, the cows are ruminants. Yeah, right. So they'll have a lot of partially degraded plant material as well in their dung. So it's quite fine. But you can use any of our domesticated animals. Their waste is fine. You could use chicken litter. You could use goat and sheep manure. You could use rabbit manure. I have used all of them. I've even used agouti manure to make excellent compost. The essence in the composting is that you just want to have your blends of nitrogen and carbon to just make sure that the process goes on. Because one of the problems you have with composting, Derval, is that a lot of people essentially have piles of degrading material, but not compost piles. So if I may just clarify that for the listeners, there's a difference between degradation and composting. And sometimes persons don't understand that. They believe that once you have a pile that is breaking down, it is composting. That is not the same. A compost pile is a very anthropogenic creation. Nature did not develop the process of composting. Man did. And man did so by heaping organic matter together. Nowhere in nature, if you go in a forest, you'll see a nice pile of material together. That doesn't occur in nature. So what occurs naturally is decomposition and degradation. Composting means the blending of those materials to effectively ensure that what happens is that biochemically the temperature raises and the heat sanitizes and accelerates the humidification and stabilization of the material. So if you're not going through that process where the temperature rises to what we call thermophilic temperatures, that is above 50 degrees Celsius, and maintains that temperature for roughly about 3 days, you are not necessarily going through a composting process. What you are going through is a decomposition process. And a lot of times that is what is happening with most persons. But that doesn't mean that the decomposed material is not good. Huh? It is good. It is just not composted. Composting also sterilizes your material because of the heat treatment that it gets. It's like pasteurization for milk. That is what composting does. So you don't find any kind of pathogens in compost. You don't find any kind of things like weed seeds or any kind of things like that, which is a difference from having normal degradation. Pathogens may still be present there, particularly if you're dealing with manures. So that's why we want persons to be very careful as well in that regard, because there's a safety issue in there.
Thank you for highlighting that distinction, Dr. Eudoxie, because I know for a lot of persons, they think we have a pile of cut grass in the back of the yard and they would call that compost. But when you get into the science of it a little bit, you understand the need for the balance between the greens and the browns, the carbon and the nitrogen, and the importance of that heat. So as I said, I'm really proud of my compost heap, and I'm looking forward to be able to use the material when I plant stuff again. I think that interest in composting is growing, but persons may not really understand fully the process. And we may also, assume it's just a natural process. But thank you for making that distinction between degradation and composting. So while we're on that topic, many persons have found or become reacquainted with their green thumb during this pandemic. So as a soils man, any words of advice for the emerging home gardener?
But of course, Derval, if you would allow me, let me just give you some more advice on your pile prior to answering that or giving a little tips. Bear in mind, the composting process is a batch process. So if you consistently add material to it, it will never finish. So what you have to do is that you have to store your material, yeah, and then create a separate pile. So it's a batch process. You have to take it from start to finish with the pile and leave the pile and then come and start a new pile altogether. And yes, it will reduce in size because as the microbes utilize some of the carbon, some of it will go up as carbon dioxide. Yeah? So yes, it will reduce generally by some of them could even be up to about 40% reduction in volume over the period of composting. So the essence is don't add fresh material all the time because it will never end. Right? So that was just some advice for you and your listeners with regards to the composting process. When it comes to home gardening, I mean, it's a wonderful thing to see what's happening here. There's so many different ways. Actually, our faculty just recently concluded a 2-month engagement with our staff at the University of the West Indies in a Grow Your Garden campaign. You know, and we had a nice little competition where we encouraged staff to have backyard gardens. You know, so one of the things persons just have to pay attention to, and you could do it in so many different ways. You could have soilless gardens, you could have container gardens, and then you could have your normal engagement with your soil in that regard. Pay attention to the area that you have available to you to try to determine the suitability of the various systems that you may wish to use. If you're in a concrete jungle like I am, I have container gardens. If you go in a container garden, please ensure one of the critical things if you're going to use containers, it has to do with the mix that you're putting in the container. You do not want one that can hold significant amounts of water. So normally you go to the shops and they sell you Pro Mix. Pro Mix is not a good soil mix for your garden. Reason being, especially in the rainy season here, Pro Mix has a very high water holding capacity. And what that could create from constant rain falling is that it creates problems of waterlogging, lack of aeration, that generally kills your growing root tips. And then you have problems of root dieback and problems of root diseases. So what you want is a well-draining media, something that, you know, we would typically use like in the grow box, you know, 1/3 sharp sand, 1/3 soil, and 1/3 organic material. That will give you a physical matrix that will allow for some amount of retentive ability of nutrients and water, but mainly that it would not remain waterlogged in your container. Similarly, if you're growing in your soils across our country and across the region, we have so much diversity in soils. We have to be aware of the soils that we're growing in. You know, when I came to Trinidad, they taught me something called sapate. You know, that is that heavy clay soil we have predominantly in Central and South. You know, we use it very nicely on cricket pitches where we want it to be hard, but for agriculture, we don't want it that hard. So it's a very hard soil to manage. So you have to be aware of the soil that you're using. If the soil is heavily clayey or if it is heavily sandy, the best thing to add to it is organic matter on either end. So what you want to do is essentially in your garden bed, when you have your dimensions, to make sure you incorporate compost in that soil. And that will transform either your sandy soils to soils that could retain a little more water nutrients, or your clay soils will give it structure that allows for drainage and allows for aeration so your plant roots could grow well. And I want to tell our listeners, one of the things, you know, outer sight, outer mind is how we typically operate. If you are a gardener, do not disregard what is happening with your root systems. When you think about how plants are the things that plants need to grow, you know, there are about 6 or 7 key factors that are required for plants to be able to grow. Only one of those factors do not involve soil, which is sunlight. All of the rest involves the roots of the plant. So if your roots are not functioning well, your plant is not functioning well. And that is one of the things that we have not paid attention to in ensuring that our root environment is adequate for the crops we want to grow. So I just want to advise the listeners that when you're going and doing your home gardening, one of the things you have to pay attention to is your root environment. We can add a lot of supplements to our soils and to our plants, but we cannot necessarily, after we plant, change the root environment. So before you plant, it is your in your best interest to, if you do not have a very amenable loam soil, and some areas in Trinidad, we have very good loam soils, particularly when you think about at the base of the Northern Range to the Caroni Basin, very good loam soils there. They need nothing more than a little bit of organic matter to assist them. But outside of that range, our soils either tend to be clay or sand. And those we have to ensure that we ameliorate to guarantee that the root environment is best for production. I will tell you, one of the things that generally troubles a lot of growers, particularly in their soils, in their gardens, is compaction of our soils, which is a physical thing. So essentially, compaction reduces the airspace, so the roots cannot penetrate because they have no oxygen and can't respire and cannot grow. And that is one of the major issues that we have. Yeah, and you cannot go in a garden shop and buy anything to remedy that compaction. It's a physical impediment that we have to address prior to growing. So what I want to advise them, pay attention to the environment you're going to put the plant in and make sure it's as amenable as possible.
So Dr. Eudoxie, it's been so good talking to you about soils and agriculture and sustainability. Is there anywhere that listeners can connect with you and your work at the University of the West Indies?
Well, certainly. I'm very open, especially being in the position that I am, which is Deputy Dean of Outreach, to facilitate and to partner and to engage with persons who may have an interest in soils or in sustainable management or in agriculture in general. And we have been very active in that regard. So we remain open. And if your listeners wish, they can contact me via email, or even via telephone. All that information is available on our faculty's webpage on the university's site.
Okay, great. I'll be sure to add your contact, your email in the show notes, as well as the link to the YouTube video, Do You Know Soils? And it just came to mind that Trinidad and Tobago's budget is on the 5th of October. So we look forward to see the share that will be allocated towards agriculture.
With anticipation.
Yes.
The road to recovery. And within that report, it is very clear that they will be paying attention or paying greater attention to agriculture. So we are hoping and with anticipation that is rewarded in the budget, and we can truly implement activities that are going to take us along a track of sustainability and resilience.
I want to thank you for joining me and sharing your insights on agriculture and soils and enlightening me and my listeners on the value of this important asset. I also enjoyed chatting about composting. I feel like we can do an entire episode just on that.
I am at your disposal in that regard. It's an area that I truly believe has application at levels that will create a different type of perspective and has the opportunity to change persons' behaviors with regards to agriculture and overall soil management. So it is something that I believe has true potential in the region. So certainly, I'll be happy to join you and your listeners again in that regard.
Thank you, Dr. Eudoxie.
Again, let me thank you and your listeners for the opportunity for being here and sharing my thoughts. It's always nice to be on a podium, so to speak, a virtual one, where you can speak to a topic that you are as well passionate about and share your views with persons who may have similar passions. So I want to extend my thanks to the Climate Conscious Podcast and their listeners for this opportunity.
So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and leave a review, and also share the podcast with a friend. Connect with us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at The Climate Conscious. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.